If anyone is having any technical difficulties at any point during the meeting, please reach out to Mackenzie Merritt at mackenzie.merritt@nebraska.gov, or obviously if you're in here, you can reach out to her in the chat too. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for the Upper Little Blue Watershed Flood Risk Review meeting. I know everyone is busy. I know times are really strange right now. We appreciate you taking the time to join us to learn where we've been with this project and where we're headed. This is only our second virtual meeting, so please bear with us if we have any technical difficulties as we work through those. And I'll apologize, I have a bit of a cold, so I'll try not to lose my voice or have anything else weird happen. But thanks again for joining. And we have this presentation, we have a story map that we're going to go through at the end, and we'll have plenty of time for questions as well. I will try to monitor the chat as we go, but feel free to unmute and ask questions as we go too. So to start out, some rules of the road. All attendees are going to be muted during the presentation just to help eliminate that background noise. You can use the chat to ask questions, or you can unmute yourself and ask questions as we go. We're pretty informal about how we do presentations, and we're not opposed to you unmuting and just asking if you need clarification or have a question on a specific slide as we go. We can pause at various points in the presentation to answer questions, and Mackenzie is going to be watching those in the chat as well to help me out. If you want to share your video, please do. It's a good way for us to connect a face with a name in this virtual world. That's the thing that we kind of miss out on in our meetings in person. If you don't feel comfortable doing so, you don't have to. You are also free to turn it on and off throughout the presentation if you'd like to as well. Again, for any technical difficulties, send a private chat to Mackenzie Merritt, or you can email her at mackenzie.merritt@nebraska.gov. We are recording today's presentation, so anyone who's unable to attend can watch it later. We'll be sending out an email link within the next couple weeks for the presentation afterwards. Zoom features that you may need to be familiar with during the webinar today. The mute and unmute button is the little microphone in the lower left corner. If you want to turn on or off your video, it's the video camera right next to that. The chat feature, which we will be using, and some of you have already found thanks to our icebreaker, is kind of in the middle, if you can see my cursor. And then there's the reactions button that some people like to use. We will be doing polls at 3 different times in today's meeting. The polls are anonymous to anyone that's on the call, but DNR will have access to the answers after the Zoom meeting, so we can follow up with anyone that has indicated that we need to do so. So yeah, we'll use that information in the background to reach out to you after the meeting. And this is kind of what the polls will look like. Make sure that you click the button and then hit submit. To start out the presentation, like usual, we're going to do some introductions. I'll introduce the team from DNR that's with us today that'll be here for questions related to this specific project. And then if you're comfortable unmuting to introduce yourself, that'd be great. Otherwise, you can throw it in the chat. If you are attending representing a community, but you have a group of people in the room with you, make sure that everyone that's in the room with you is introduced so that we can make sure that we have that in our sign-in to document everybody that attended today. So I'm Jamie Ranke. I'm an engineer in the floodplain management section of DNR. I manage the CTP work that we do. I am mostly responsible for reviewing most of that work, specifically the enhanced study work, and then I manage the contract projects that we have. We also have with us Deanna Ringenberg. She should have her video on and waving to everyone if you can see her. She is also an engineer in the floodplain management team. She completed the study for the city of Hebron for this watershed. And she also helps with base flood elevation determinations. She reviews some of our basic study areas. She's kind of a jack of all trades for us. We also have Adele Phillips. She's our flood mitigation planner. And she will be covering the mitigation slides in today's presentation, and she helps manage the flood mitigation assistance, or FMA, grant for the department. So she'll be available for questions later on too. Michelle York is our administrative assistant. She is our right-hand person that helps us with everything. She is probably the person that everyone on the call is familiar with. She has been emailing, mailing, calling everyone to remind you about the meeting today. So I'm sure most of you have seen her name. Now you get to see her face. And then we have Mackenzie Merritt. She is helping me run the Zoom meeting in the background and will be available for technical difficulties. And she's a fairly new addition to our team and has been a really great asset for us. So that's our team. And I'll let you guys unmute yourselves to introduce who's on the call with us today.
Bonnie Welch-Hubble.
Holt Manager with Thayer County Emergency Management.
You say your name. Oh. Edith Lowry. Hubble.
All right, thank you.
Sandra Shen, City of Nelson.
Thanks for joining us, Sandra.
Kyle Hochschild, Little Blue NRD.
Hi, Kyle.
Morning.
Tyler Geschel, Assistant Manager, Little Blue NRD.
Alicia Epps, Database Specialist, Little Blue NRD.
Thank you for joining us, Little Blue NRD.
Lexi Hint, Nebraska Emergency Management Agency. And then I have Sarah Jackson from NEMA as well.
Thank you, Nima.
John McKee, Jefferson County Emergency Management.
Hi, John.
Okay.
All right, is there anyone else on the call that'd like to introduce themselves, or some extras in a room anywhere?
Susie Comacher, City of Blue Hill.
Thank you.
Nick Elledge, Knuckles County Emergency Management.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for joining us.
Steve Oakman, City of Dashler.
It looks like we've got most people. It looks like Lori Bestian and Emily Hatcher joined us from FEMA Region 7. All right, we'll go ahead and continue with the presentation. Thank you, everyone. So why do we do this work? We have evidence of flooding all over the state in our office, specifically as far back as 1881. We actually have photos from flooding that occurred in Niobrara in 1881, but we know that flooding was happening well before then. You can see in the image on this slide, photos from the Republican River flood in 1935. It was one of the most catastrophic floods in Nebraska's history, and prompted kind of a change in how people were looking at managing floods and trying to reduce the loss of life and property from flooding. We have evidence from the 50s, 60s, 70s in the Lincoln area, the Big Blue River Basin, the Little Blue River, and then some more recent examples, the Missouri River in 2011 and 2019. In this watershed, we know that you have all lived through flooding fairly recently too, in 2015 and in 2019. And while maybe all of these flood events, the Missouri River or the Little Blue River, weren't 100-year events, the flooding was still quite severe. Flooding is the most common and costliest natural hazard. Approximately 75% of disaster declarations involve some level of flooding. That's why understanding how and where it's likely to flood in your area is so important. And you've seen it recently, so you know what areas are flood prone and can help with this project by helping us know that our boundaries are making sense too. So why do we need to update flood maps? Flood risk changes over time and for many reasons. The last updates in this area occurred in the early 2000s. So Kearney County was last updated in 2004, 2005. There was not an FIS prepared for that study, so there's no information related to how the boundaries were created. And we are proposing new regulatory maps for the portion of Kearney County that is within the upper Little Blue watershed. Nuckolls County flood risk information was updated in 2004, but again, there was no FIS for the study, so we have no information related to how those boundaries were created. And we are proposing new regulatory information for the portion of Nuckolls County that's within the upper Little Blue watershed. Thayer County flood risk was last updated in 2004, and FIS was prepared as part of that study, but only details the information related to the enhanced study in the city of Hebron. The boundaries were created using topographic maps with a contour interval of 10 feet. The updated flood risk information, as you can see in this image, is going to show a color aerial in the background. We used transparent boundaries so you can easily identify structures in the background. You can see the previous mapping used that dotted hatching, which is kind of hard to identify structures. The new digital format is georeferenced, so it shows up where it belongs in each community. It's based on more detailed and accurate topographic information. So we're using LiDAR, that large scale data collection method for obtaining topography. The LiDAR in this area was from 2009, so it's a little bit dated, but is still better than, say, a 10-foot contour interval that was used in the 2004 study. And I think the most valuable piece of updating the flood risk information is that the data is reproducible, since FEMA requires that in all of their study areas now. So basic or enhanced, it has to be model backed. And that only helps people when they're going to make a change in the floodplain. And from the perspective of people who are regulating floodplain development, having reproducible data is really important. The new maps also will, in the future, for those areas getting new regulatory maps, determine where flood insurance is required for structures with federally backed mortgages, and will provide the basis for updating your floodplain management ordinance, which is really your community's tool for reducing flood risk. And DNR has a model ordinance that is available for you to use for that. DNR will be here to help walk you through what that looks like, and will do the review and help make sure that FEMA gets their review in of the model or of the ordinance update. So what do we want to achieve in today's meeting? We want to help you understand your current flood risk and also get feedback from you on what the draft maps are showing us. After this meeting, there will be a letter that goes out to initiate a 30-day review of the boundaries, of community boundaries, floodplain boundaries, road names, extraterritorial jurisdiction boundaries, pretty much anything that you can review in the map, you can provide a comment on. I will add the caveat that just because there's a comment doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a drastic change in the floodplain mapping. We had a community at one point that submitted a comment that said, I don't want floodplain here, and circled the channel and surrounding floodplain. Our commenting doesn't work that way. We're not going to be able to just eliminate floodplain because a community doesn't want it there. I think in general, most people don't want to have floodplain, but it's important for your community to know their flood risk, and that's what our project is all about. Reviewing other flood risk data tools, specifically flood risk products that have been created as part of this project, and how those products can help you make informed decisions about reducing flood risk in your community. And then lastly, we're going to review what's next for the project and what your role is in the next steps. So a quick recap of where we've been in this project. It's been a while since we've gotten together. DNR started our work in this project in 2017. However, there was a previous study that was done for Adams and Clay counties that was initiated in 2014, I believe. So they were already getting effective maps by the time that we kicked off this piece of work. FEMA contractor completed discovery in this watershed before DNR got started in 2017. So we weren't involved other than in attending meetings and providing data in the discovery phase. That discovery meeting took place in January of 2011, for those of you who were around for that. The kickoff meeting for this data development, the engineering phase of work that we're in right now, was in November of 2017. So it's been a while since we've gotten together. And DNR, this meeting basically is the end of that engineering phase, that data development phase. And then we move into preliminary map production and the regulatory process. So we have completed this work in-house at DNR with financial support from FEMA. So it was funded by FEMA through our grants. Now we're going to ask our first poll question of the day. All right, it looks like polling has slowed down. Okay, so it looks like we have half of the people on the call today that have attended one of the meetings, one of the two meetings that's occurred for this watershed. We have an equal split then of people who have attended none or are new to this project and don't have any background on it. So we're gonna do a little recap of where we've been, how we got to where we are today. So those of you that are new, you'll have that information. And those of you who didn't attend the kickoff meeting, you'll have that information. Those of you who did attend the kickoff meeting in particular, some of this information may be repeated, but it's been a while, so it's a good recap and important information for you to understand, I think. Thank you for answering the poll question, everyone. So our community partners, this is the list of communities that we've been communicating with. Most of you are probably very familiar with our project updates that you get every quarter. These are the communities we're reaching out to that we want to have reviewing the data, that have helped us kind of get to this point, and your feedback is appreciated. Your time and any effort that you've put into this project thus far is greatly appreciated. We know at the end of the day, these maps are yours and you're going to be using them. You're going to be answering questions related to them. So the fact that you're with us today, that you've participated in this process, is the most valuable part of what we do. The next phase of the presentation is going to be reviewing the draft maps and looking at what your updated flood risk looks like based on this project. We'll do an overview of how the mapping takes place, and we'll do a quick tour of an interactive map showing you those boundaries. The map development process, for those of you at the kickoff meeting, this is the slide that we kind of use to explain how we got there, how we got to where we are. The first step in all of our projects is this base map collection, as FEMA calls it. And that's really just collecting aerial information. So we have that nice aerial imagery in the background, the community boundaries and extraterritorial jurisdictions, the ETJ boundaries for those that regulate to an ETJ, road names. All of that information is collected that will then be used for the final mapping products, the flood insurance rate maps, firm panels that will be created later on in this process. Most of you should have seen emails coming from DNR requesting community boundaries and ETJ boundaries. So if those have been updated since we've reached out to you, please send that in to us, any changes, so that we can get that on the new maps. But we rely on base map information from other sources. It's not usually ours. Topography, again, mentioning that we're using LiDAR data that was flown in or collected in 2009. And LiDAR is just a large scale collection method to determine ground elevations, as opposed to collecting survey, which at a watershed wide scale would be labor intensive and really wouldn't make sense from a cost standpoint. So we take all of that information, we determine how much water is going into the system, we cut cross sections that are representative of the area to determine how deep that water gets, and develop a floodplain boundary. This orange color being the 0.2%, or commonly called the 500-year, the blue boundary being the 1%, or commonly referred to as the 100-year, and then this red hatched area is the floodway. And then you add all that information together and get what shows up on the firm panels in the end. In this area, you would have cross-section information instead of BFE information. DNR has kind of gotten away from publishing BFEs. We publish the elevation of the cross-section instead, so your firm panel might look slightly different. But if you were to request a base flood elevation determination from DNR, you would still see the squiggly BFE lines like are shown on this map. So through the process of the engineering or data development phase, we develop several products. The draft floodplain boundaries, which we've covered, but we also develop flood risk products, which are fairly new. The main point right now is that if you have feedback on any of the boundaries or questions on how to use any of them, now is the time to provide that feedback, when we can still incorporate it before we get into regulatory steps in the project. So once we issue preliminary products, it's a much more labor intensive effort for a community to make a change, specifically a change related to a boundary, a floodplain boundary, or something that looks like it's incorrect. We do our best to review this data as carefully as we can, but you know, we're working at a HUC 8 watershed level, a very large scale project area. So it is possible that there are things that might be inconsistent with what's happening in real life. So that's why your input and review is so valuable. And while the data is still in draft form, we can make those changes at DNR without the community having to put much effort into it at all. It would be if, you know, there's development that's occurred, providing us with some survey data, or if you're seeing something that's inconsistent with how flooding is occurring, providing that to us in a comment so we can look into it in more detail. We have that flexibility to look into it and make those changes now. Once we get to the preliminary issuance phase, that flexibility really goes away, and the only way to address it is through an appeal or a letter of map change after the project is complete, which adds a burden to the community to hire an engineer to do that study for you. So now is really the time to provide those comments and provide that feedback. So developing tools that help in your daily work, those flood risk products, there are a suite of products that are available, the flood risk report, flood risk map, which I'll cover in the next 2 slides. But there are also data tools that visualize flood risk in a different way than we're used to help you understand where you have most impact in your community. So historically, floodplain mapping through FEMA was a line on a map. You had a boundary and you were either in that boundary or you were out of that boundary. And while that's still what's shown on a firm panel, that's not the only information that FEMA now funds. We now create flood risk products, which include this list of items on your screen: the flood depth grids, so the depth of flooding at any point within that floodplain boundary. So yes, you may be in the boundary, but now you can click on a map and see that the flood depth for a 1% event is 1.1 feet. As opposed to someone thinking that just because they're in the boundary, it means that they're going to see 15 foot of flooding. The percent annual chance grids are the percent chance in any given year that a property is likely to flood. And I will show you the depth grids, the percent annual chance grids, and the percent 30-year chance grids in coming slides. The percent 30-year chance grid is the percent chance over the course of a 30-year period that a structure or property would see flooding. So you would click on a point and it would give you a percentage, and that percentage would be the percent chance over 30 years that you would see flooding. The changes since last firm, since this area does already have digital products, the changes since last firm basically just outline what the changes in floodplain boundaries look like. The flood risk assessment is determining the average annualized loss for different locations to determine the losses associated with flooding in the area. And then areas of mitigation interest are just that. They're areas that have been identified for mitigation projects. Maybe there have been mitigation projects that have taken place. Oftentimes they're pulled from the hazard mitigation plan as those two programs try to align a little bit. So those are the products that are available in flood risk products that you'll have available to you at the conclusion of this project. The flood risk report, which I didn't cover much before, it provides background on flood hazards and risk, the risk reduction practices that are taking place within a watershed, and then it outlines the project methodology and results for those depth and percent chance grids, that risk assessment, and details any enhanced analyses that took place. In this watershed, the only enhanced study that took place was in Hebron. The flood risk map is a map of the watershed that identifies flood risk data, areas that are prone to flooding, risk reduction activities and impacts that have taken place throughout the watershed, areas where mitigation maybe should be a focus area, and encourages the community to focus on reducing risk, which is really what this program is all about, is identifying risk, but also encouraging looking at that long-term how to reduce flood risk. So I will exit out of the PowerPoint and we will do a quick little tour of our interactive map. For those of you who haven't used it, Michelle, Mackenzie, can you guys see the interactive map on your screen? Okay. You would just go to the floodplain management page of DNR's website, go to this interactive maps, and it's the main interactive map on that page. So you hit the agree, go over and hit continue. There are a couple different ways that you can get to a community. You can just type in Hebron, Nebraska, or there's this handy little drop down that you can search communities. And it'll pull up the boundaries. This green on the outside edge is representing an extraterritorial jurisdiction for Hebron. You can barely see it, but there is a boundary here on the inside that shows the actual community boundary, not just the ETJ boundary. I am going to go ahead and turn off a bunch of layers because we right now have overlapping data because we have the effective maps showing. Okay, so this flood awareness area is where the draft floodplain boundaries reside. So if you want to take a look at that when you get into the review after this meeting, the flood awareness area is where it's at. For this particular tutorial, we're going to do the flood risk products though. So I will apologize, our color ramp, this is a brand new map. It just went live a couple weeks ago and our color ramp is having some issues that I noticed yesterday and we didn't have time to fix them. Know that it won't always look this ugly. But if you turn on the 1% annual chance depth grid, you can see that it's lining up with that boundary for the flood awareness area. This is just the 1%, so it was showing the 0.2% outside, but anywhere that you click on the map, it'll show up with a little triangle. At that point, there's 8.8 feet of flood depth for the 1% event. You can see when you get into the red, it's 17.5 feet. If you get into these just outer fringe areas, there's 1/10 of a foot of flooding. So you can see how that can help community members, residents of communities understand their flood risk a little bit better. And we would have the same thing for the 0.2%. Where if you click on this structure right here, there's 5.4 foot of flooding at that corner. Whereas with the 1% event, there was 4.3. So it's deeper for the 0.2%, which you would expect. So these are, like I showed you on our interactive map, you can play around with them. Know that the color ramp will be fixed and the percent annual chance grids, if I zoom out a little bit so you can see those, show that percent chance in any given year that a property would flood. So we'll pick on the same house, and you can see the color ramp shows where it's less severe. There's only a 0.3% chance any given year that that location would flood. But if we clicked on this corner of that property, there's a 10% chance any year that that property would flood. And then the percent 30-year chance for that same property on this corner, there's almost a 10% chance over the course of 30 years that that location would flood. But in this red area, there's a almost 96% chance of flooding at that location. So we find them to be really useful tools. We tend to use them in our public open houses when we get to that stage, and it really helps the conversation with residents who don't necessarily understand what the floodplain mapping is all about. All right, are you seeing the PowerPoint again? Yes, okay. Now we'll do a poll to see how people would prefer to review this information. All right, it looks like polling has slowed down. So if you have, okay, can everyone see the results? It looks like most people were comfortable with the live guided tour or reviewing it on an interactive map on their own, which is great. Those of you who selected that you wanted a PDF or a mailed copy or need some help in getting to the interactive map or doing this review in an interactive map, we will follow up with you after the meeting. So thank you for sharing your answers. So when we say that we want you to do a review of the information, what exactly is it that we're asking you to review and comment on? I've mentioned a couple different times, road names, community boundaries, ETJs, that information, the community boundaries and ETJs for sure, we are not a repository for that. So there is no way for us to correct that information if you don't provide it to us. And if you've made changes since we reached out to you, probably in early 2018, that won't be reflected in the maps. So if you've made changes to your community boundary or ETJ in the last couple years, please send that to us and we'll get it updated in the maps. Beyond that, what are we asking you to look for? Areas of significant flooding that you've seen in the past, making sure that the boundaries are making sense in those areas where you do have historic flooding that's occurred. Areas with repeated flooding or property loss, those would be areas that we would be wanting to identify as potential mitigation locations. And we know that there's been some mitigation that's occurred in this watershed. There has been at least one buyout recently in the Hebron area. And we know that there has been ongoing studies taking place in Deschler. So we know that this is happening. We don't always know about it. So if you can point it out to us, that would be really helpful. Locations with new or recent development since LIDAR was flown in 2009. We do know that there's been flooding in 2015 and 2019, so it would have been great if we had had LIDAR from post 2015 at least. Since we didn't have that, we used the best that we had. Knowing that the enhanced study in Hebron was based on or was supplemented with survey data, so any of the little Blue River structures that were updated, I think there was one that was updated, we would have gotten new survey information on that. The Spring Creek in Hebron was not an enhanced study, so that bridge replacement doesn't really apply because Zone A doesn't take bridges into account. But if you have locations that you had new or recent development beyond that, that you feel should be incorporated into the maps. We would just need survey data or updated topo data, something of that nature. So reach out to us and we can work with you to get the information that we need to be able to incorporate it into the maps. Locations with planned new development. This is important when you start looking at the draft floodplain boundaries to see if those locations maybe were not in the floodplain before but are now. We would want to think through strategies to either maybe move the development so it's not going to occur in the floodplain, or strategies to protect that development from flooding. Areas where mitigation and actions to control flooding have occurred. I know that NRD has constructed dams in the area, probably some in fairly recent history that wouldn't be included in the mapping. But other mitigation that's happened or mitigation that you're planning to do, it would be helpful for us to know that. And then areas where you or your community have prioritized to address flood issues. Not that that would necessarily change anything in the mapping. It's just helpful for us to know that that's going on or is something that is being looked at. And now I will pass it over to Adele to cover the mitigation slides.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adele Phillips. I'm the new flood mitigation planner with the Department of Natural Resources. And my screen's all in order. Thank you again for attending today's meeting. Again, I'm here to talk about mitigation and mitigation measures. Mitigation measures are actions we take to reduce hazard threats and impacts to life and property. Now, mitigation measures will reduce your flood risk, and reducing flood risk in turn can mean decreasing the premiums you and your neighbors pay on flood insurance. It means keeping property and loved ones safe. It means maintaining quality of life, and it means improving your community's resilience. Resiliency, whether or to what degree your community is resilient, affects how well your community recovers from a disaster. And when we work towards resiliency, that means taking actions now that can help keep you and your community safe in the future. And think of the whole health of your community and the quality of life of its residents. Think of the things your community values most, the well-being of families, the safety of their homes and neighborhoods, health and recreation opportunities, and protection of your financial investments. Resiliency is how much you safeguard these things in advance and how rapidly you can recover in the event of a disaster. When you have identified your mitigation measures that build your resiliency, you want to capture these or put these goals and actions into your long-range planning instruments. Mackenzie will put a link into the chat to our department's resource guide to comprehensive plans and flood risk. Now, long-range plans are such things as comprehensive land use plans, general plans, hazard mitigation plans. In these long-range planning instruments, you can enable watershed scale or landscape scale practices that require the long-term planning and coordination. These actions need multiple stakeholders on board in order to make them happen. All NRDs have hazard mitigation plans, and participating communities have subsections within these plans within which the community can capture the mitigation measures that are important to them. These plans are updated on a 5-year cycle. The plans are an easy and important way to set out the guiding actions for your community's flood resilience. Again, think of the people and things that you value most. Ask yourself, what steps could I take today to protect these lives and property from future flood events. From my understanding, Silver Jackets did do a parcel by parcel evaluation of flood-prone properties in Deschler, DeWitt, and Hebron. This is very important information that those communities can use to identify appropriate mitigation measures at the community level. Critical facilities. Critical facilities are the facilities that need to remain operational in your community during and after a disaster. Examples of critical facilities include hospitals, nursing homes, fire departments, your power supply, drinking water supply, wastewater treatment. Use this new flood risk data to safeguard these existing facilities and use it to avoid putting future facilities in high-risk areas. Another example is of elevating homes above flood levels. This is a straightforward action to reduce property loss. Here we have two images of structures that have been elevated, such that the flood waters will not damage living quarters. When you elevate a home, your insurance costs go down. And a still more effective option is to remove development from the floodplain altogether. Here we have two images, both from Beatrice, Nebraska. The home on the left was removed, amongst others, to create the open space that you now see in the right-hand image. Flooding occurs naturally along every river. Removing structures and these impermeable surfaces helps restore natural floodplain functions. And natural floodplain functions include provision of wildlife habitat, the storage and slowing down of floodwaters, the protection of water quality, and the recharge of groundwater. When we remove development from the floodplain, we actually are protecting our interests and we create a healthier overall community. And the city of Beatrice is a beautiful example of an effective buyout program. Since 1973, the community has developed a program of acquiring flood-prone properties and converting them to open space and parks. The city has, through this program, expanded its recreational facilities while avoiding costly flood impacts. In 2015, the community was struck by the third largest flood in its history. And at that time, Beatrice officials were able to estimate that in that single flood event, they avoided nearly $13 million in flood damage. In addition to that, the flood damage that did occur was to a lesser degree than what would have occurred had none of the structures been removed. Now, in this slide, the diagram on the right, and I don't know if you'll be able to read the legend, but those small green parcels are properties that were bought out, and the blue shading represents their floodplain. And Mackenzie will put a link in our chat to Beatrice's story map where you can see more images and you can learn more about the history of Beatrice's buyout program. Okay. And there are even simple, smaller scale solutions than property buyout and structure removal too that can reduce your community's flood risk. This is green infrastructure. These neighborhood scale solutions are a distributed stormwater management approach. These practices are about managing rainwater where it falls. So capturing the rainwater on site where it lands. When it rains, our roads and other impervious surfaces essentially act as tributaries in a watershed. So putting in bioswales or vegetated swales like we see in the left-hand image, those help capture, slow, and filter stormwater. And the same goes for for rainwater catchment barrels, like the blue one you see at the home on the right. And also in that image, you can see that the downspout leads to a rain garden. These small interventions upstream have impacts downstream towards reducing flood. Next slide. All right, here we have two images of the same field. One on the left is before and one on the right is after grass waterway has been installed. So again, this is green infrastructure, very relatively small scale local intervention that can reduce flood impacts downstream. Now, there are a few federal funding sources available for hazard mitigation activities. The first two, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC, are administered through NEMA. We have Lexi Hintz, and I can't remember who else Lexi is with you, but we've got representatives from Nebraska Emergency Management Agency on the call. And Mackenzie is going to put the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, John Gassman's contact information into the chat window as well. So if you're interested in pursuing Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funds or BRIC funds, please work with NEMA on that. The next fund, Flood Mitigation Assistance Grants, is administered through Department of Natural Resources, and I can help you with that grant application and the administration thereafter. My contact information will be at the end of the slideshow. Flood mitigation assistance grants, you can support planning activities as well as property buyout and structure removal. The key objective, though, with flood mitigation assistance grants is removing or demonstrating that NFIP insurance claims will be reduced through the activities supported by the grant. And then one more grant that's available is the Community Development Block Grants. These are available through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. A very large example of CDBG watershed activities is actually going on right now in Southwest Iowa in the Nishnabotna River watershed. So search for Nishnabotna River watershed projects and you'll learn a lot about how CDBG grants are being used to reduce flood risk. Okay. And remember that the parcel level surveys that Silver Jackets did that I mentioned earlier, this information is helpful supporting information in pursuing these grants. So don't lose sight of that data. We're going to wrap up this mitigation section with a poll question. Do you have mitigation projects underway that you could use help with? And Jamie, you'll have to let us know how poll results are coming.
It looks like we have half of the people who have voted. But no one else is jumping on, so I think we can stop and share the results.
All right, looks like there's lots of opportunity to get mitigation projects started. For those of you who are interested in learning more, or the ones who answered, but I could use some help getting something off the ground, feel free to contact me and we'll get that conversation started. And those of you with the yes I'll follow up with you via email after this meeting.
All right, thank you, Adele, for covering the mitigation piece of our presentation. And we will finish up the presentation portion with the next steps that are coming up in the coming days and months for this project. We're almost there, 3 more slides to go. Next steps for DNR, as I've mentioned a couple times during the meeting, we will send letters to each community requesting your review of the floodplain boundaries, community boundaries, all of that information, and providing us with any feedback. That letter is scheduled to go out today. With it will be a couple of attachments, one explaining the flood risk products, the other explaining how to use our online comment site. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions on any of that. This is a FEMA required review period that it requires that we have that 30 days, but oftentimes you have more than 30 days to provide comments. We really can incorporate comments in almost up to the time of preliminary issuance. You know, if it's a bigger change, it's not something that's going to be incorporated in a week, then it isn't going to be right up to preliminary issuance. But generally speaking, community boundaries, road names, those types of changes can occur all the way up to preliminary issuance. After that review period, we will begin developing preliminary products. So those products that are one step before final maps or effective maps. We are going forward with effective products for all of Thayer County and the pieces of Nuckolls County and Kearney County that are within the Upper Little Blue watershed. I have a map in the story map here in just a few minutes that I can show you which pieces those are. We right now are scheduled to issue preliminary products for those areas in late spring of 2021. And then after that point, we enter into that regulatory process where everything is defined by FEMA or the Code of Federal Regulations, and we just have certain steps that we have to meet before we get to effective maps. That process at a minimum takes 18 months. It can take up to 24 months, just depending on how things go. If there are a lot of disasters and FEMA staff get pulled off for response or recovery, then maybe it's going to take longer to publish in the Federal Register or something that could slow things down. So it's just kind of out of our hands. We just have to follow the process. We expect that we'll have effective maps if all goes per plan in 2022 to 2023 timeframe, depending on how that post-preliminary process goes. The next steps for you, again, reviewing the floodplain boundaries, providing any feedback. We accept that feedback in any form that you're comfortable with. It can be in our comment site on the interactive map. It can be snail mail, email, phone, whatever you're comfortable with. We appreciate you taking the time to do it and providing those comments. So reach out to anyone with any questions that you have, or if you're having difficulty getting those comments back to us. And then letting us know if there's anything that we can do to help with mitigation activities that you're interested in. The key takeaway from this next steps slide, though, is that now is the time that we can still incorporate your input into the maps. Again, you'll have more than 30 days to get us that information. We have to give you 30 days per FEMA. It often ends up being several months that you have to review and provide comments, but I would suggest doing it now while it's fresh in your mind so you don't forget. We do send out a reminder email on this review period midway through the review, just so that everyone who wasn't here today knows that that review is still ongoing. But by the time that we get to preliminary maps, the step to change the information that's being published in those maps require a lot more effort, resources, time, money on your part. So we really encourage communities to take the time now to review the information and make sure it makes sense, and reach out to us with any questions or concerns that you have. Here are contacts for the main people answering questions related to this project. Me, Deanna, who was the engineer who did the enhanced study in Hebron, and Adele for any of your mitigation questions. And with that, we can open it up for questions if there are any. Feel free to unmute and ask your questions live or you can type them in the chat either way. Quiet group today. Hearing no questions, I will go ahead and give a quick little tour of the story map. Maybe. There we go. Okay. Can you see my screen with the story map on it? Okay, I'm getting some nods, yes. So what we've done with the story maps is created a kind of one-stop shop for all information related to this project. We tried to keep it really high level. We worked with a group to help us tone the language down so it's not really heavy in the engineering speak, but really just trying to outline the steps of the project, providing updates on where we're at, where we're going, and just give you a general sense of what the project is all about. These projects last a really long time, so this was a way to combine all of that information in one area and provide that hopefully project update in the future through this avenue, as opposed to those PDFs that get emailed out to you every quarter. So this is the draft form of the story map that's been created specifically for the Upper Little Blue watershed. We have tabs at the top for the different phases of work or different areas of the story map. The overview just goes through kind of the general purpose of the story map and project, where we are, and just a general overview of the work that DNR has done, explaining how flood risk changes over time. We link to FEMA videos. It has our interactive map in the background, which is, if you hit the explore button, you're able to zoom around. This shows, the yellow shows the outline of the watershed. The yellow outline is the area that we're moving forward with new regulatory maps, but you can see the floodplains in these other areas, the smaller pieces of Franklin, Webster counties, Fillmore County over here. Those are areas where you have updated data, but it's not going to be carried forward into regulatory products right now. In the future, if we initiate projects in some of these neighboring watersheds, that information would likely be used for regulatory updates in the future, depending on whether there's new LIDAR data, and there are a multitude of things that can change between now and then, but it can be used as best available data currently, but will not be carried forward to new effective maps at this time. So this overview then gives kind of just a summary of the different project phases and concludes with a FEMA video. Most of the tabs will conclude with a FEMA video. The updates and milestones is where most of that project update is going to occur. Just a brief little summary. Flood risk products are being prepared for FEMA submittal outreach. We hosted this meeting today. After the meeting, you're going to be getting this letter, and then upcoming work is beginning work on preliminary panels. So not altogether dissimilar from what you're seeing, just a different format. And then we outline the different touch points that we've had with the communities: discovery meeting, kickoff meeting, the flood risk review meeting that has to be updated for today, all the way through the effective maps. And then we have this graphic that kind of goes through the different major steps in the post-preliminary process. And we have flood history section that is specific to this watershed. This is the photo that I would love to get permission to use. I have not been able to so far. So this is what's limiting me from being able to put this public. So this image might go, but we get into local flood accounts, and here you can see that outline of the watershed. So the pieces of Knuckles County, everything north of this line will be new effective maps. And then discovery, just a general overview of what that phase of work is all about. This creating flood risk data is the portion of work that we're discussing today, that engineering phase, the data development phase of a project that talks about the actual study itself. I see I have a map that's not loading in the background, so I'll take care of that. And we have all of these FEMA videos. They autoplay in the background, but you can click on them. You can unmute them so that they play. They're nice videos in that they're told from the perspective of a local floodplain administrator or surveyor, whoever that may be. We found them to be very valuable tools to have for communities. Explaining LiDAR, and then yeah, it goes into, we take that LiDAR data. Everything is loading very slowly today. I apologize. Well, what this slide should show is the cross sections. It's apparently not going to work today, but I will make sure it's working before I post it live. And then the regulatory steps specific to this jurisdiction. And then there are two tabs one on flood insurance and then one on reducing flood risk. As we make it through the project, the story map should be updated as we make it into those different phases of work. All right, any questions come up as we did the little tour of the story map? All right, hearing none, I will just thank you again for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. Look for that letter to be coming in the next few days. It'll come certified mail, so you'll have to sign for it. And then feel free to follow up with any of us with any questions. We will send an email reminder in the future on that 30-day review. And we look forward to working with you as we get closer to effective products. So thank you all.